I spent 14 years clawing my way into one of Chicago's most powerful law firms so I could hand my parents the retirement they deserved. I wrote a check for $550,000 and built them a dream home from the ground up in Memphis. Then one Tuesday morning, a bank fraud alert hit my phone. And in the 72 hours that followed, I discovered my entire family had been conspiring against me from the very beginning. What they never counted on was this I had already known for 3 weeks. The notification came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. Not the first one. The third. I was sitting at my desk on the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago, working through a stack of deposition transcripts for a corporate merger case that had already consumed the better part of my month. The city was just beginning to wake up below me. Gray morning light pushing through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the distant sound of traffic rising up from the streets like a slow, indifferent tide. I had been in the office since 5. That was not unusual. That was just Tuesday. The thing about being a litigator is that you learn over time to exist in a permanent state of controlled tension. You are always waiting for something to go wrong, not because you are paranoid, but because in this profession, something always eventually does. You build your cases carefully. You seal every gap. You prepare for every possible ambush. And then you sit at your desk at 5 in the morning and you work, because the work is the only thing standing between your client and a verdict they cannot afford. That morning, the ambush did not come from a courtroom. My phone buzzed against the surface of my desk screen, side up the way I always kept it during early morning work sessions. I glanced at it the way you glance at things when you are deep in the middle of something important. Half your attention, none of your patience. But the moment I read the sender's name, I set my pen down. First Federal Mortgage Services, fraud alert. I picked up the phone and read the full message carefully. A refinancing application had been initiated on a residential property registered to my private holding company, Sterling Property, LLC, located at 4814 Maple Ridge Drive, Memphis, Tennessee. The application had been flagged because the initiating party did not match the authorized ownership records on file. I set the phone back down, very slowly. The first alert had come 6 weeks earlier. I had called the bank immediately, been told it was most likely a clerical processing error on their end, and filed the whole thing in the back of my mind. The way busy people file things they do not want to deal with, carefully enough to retrieve later, far enough back not to think about now. The second alert had arrived 2 weeks after that. Same property, same flag. I had called again, been transferred across 3 different departments, and ultimately been assured by a supervisor that the application had been formally rejected, and the matter was fully resolved. This was the third alert. I am a litigator. I have spent 14 years in courtrooms and high-stakes conference rooms learning to read the precise difference between coincidence and deliberate pattern. 2 alerts might reasonably be a system error. 3 alerts on the same property within 6 weeks is someone trying very hard and very persistently to do something they have absolutely no right to do. I thought about that property for a moment. I had purchased the land 2 years ago and spent the following 8 months overseeing every detail of the construction, the floor plan, the fixtures, the wraparound porch. My mother had always wanted the custom woodworking studio in the back for my father. I had written the final check myself, $550,000. I had driven down to Memphis on a Saturday morning in October, handed my parents the keys, and watched my father walk slowly through every room of a house he never in his life believed he would live in. That image, his hand trailing along the kitchen counter, his eyes bright and overwhelmed, had stayed with me ever since as the single clearest proof that everything I had sacrificed to build my career had been worth it. Now, someone was trying to borrow against it without my knowledge or consent. I pulled up the direct line for my personal banker at First Federal, a woman named Patricia, who had managed the Sterling LLC accounts for the past 4 years. and who understood, without being told, that when I called, the matter was serious. She answered on the second ring. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice level and deliberate, the way I kept it in every room where the stakes were elevated. "I need you to pull the complete application record on the Maple Ridge property, the one connected to this morning's alert. I need the full name listed on the initiating paperwork." There was the sound of keys clicking rapidly. A brief silence. And then Patricia's voice returned, careful, measured, the voice of a professional who had just read something that concerned her. "The application was submitted under a power of attorney claim," she said. "The name listed as the authorized representative is another pause, shorter this time, Brandon Reeves." I did not react. I had trained myself over 14 years of litigation not to react to information in real time, not in front of anyone who might be watching. You absorb it. You file it. You decide what it means later in private when you have the full picture. But I want to be honest about what happened in the 3 or 4 seconds after Patricia said that name. Brandon Reeves was my younger brother. He was 32 years old. He lived in Memphis. He had grown up in the same cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago, where I had grown up, had attended the same underfunded public schools, had been handed at every critical turning point in his life, every advantage and accommodation and second chance that our parents could scrape together to give him. He had never held a meaningful position for longer than 18 months. He had never paid a bill on time. He had never, not once, in 32 years, demonstrated the kind of sustained discipline and follow-through that building anything real requires. He was also not listed anywhere on any document connected to that property. Not as a resident, not as an emergency contact, not as a representative, not as anything at all. I thanked Patricia quietly. I asked her to place an immediate freeze on any further applications or transactions connected to the Maple Ridge address. I ended the call. For a long moment, I simply sat there, looking out at the city below me. The morning light had shifted from pale gray to a thin, watery gold. On the street, 34 floors down, the ordinary machinery of a Chicago Tuesday was already in motion. Delivery trucks, commuters, the indifferent rhythm of a city that did not know or care that something in my world had just cracked open. I turned back to my desk. I opened a clean document on my laptop. I set the font to 12-point Times New Roman, the same typeface I used for every case file I had built across 14 years of practice. I positioned my cursor at the top of the blank page, and I typed 3 words. Then I underlined them. I sat with those 3 words for a moment, feeling the full weight of what they meant and what they were going to require of me. Then I picked up my phone and called my private investigator. To understand what I did next, you need to understand what 14 years of being the invisible daughter actually costs. Not in dollars, though eventually it would come to that too. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Halsted Street, where the radiator knocked all winter and the windows never quite sealed against the cold. My parents, Robert and Gloria Reeves, were not bad people. I want to be clear about that. My father worked 30 years at a sheet metal fabrication plant in Bridgeport, leaving before dawn and coming home after dark with grease under his fingernails and a quiet dignity that I have spent my entire adult life trying to live up to. My mother kept the household running on a budget that should not have been able to keep anything running at all. They were hardworking, church-going, deeply proud people who loved their children the best way they knew how. The trouble was, they did not love their children equally. Brandon came along 4 years after me, the baby of the family. And from the moment he arrived, the entire gravitational center of our household shifted toward him. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of quiet, not cruel. It was the kind of quiet, persistent favoritism that families rarely acknowledge, because it never takes the form of a single, obvious moment. It accumulates, the way water accumulates in a low place, slowly and without announcement, until one day you look down and realize you are standing in it. When I was 15, I applied for a summer academic enrichment program at the University of Illinois. The application required a $40 fee. I asked my mother for the money on a Thursday evening. She told me the budget was tight that week and suggested I ask again the following month. The following Saturday, my father took Brandon to a sporting goods store and bought him a brand new bicycle because, as my mother explained to me later, he had been asking for one for a long time. I never resubmitted that application. I got a job at a dry cleaner, 2 blocks from our apartment instead, and paid my own fees from that point forward. That was the year I understood how things worked in the Reeves household. I applied to 7 universities my senior year of high school. I wrote every essay myself, stayed late in the school library to use the computers because we did not have reliable internet at home, and tracked down every scholarship opportunity I could find with the focused intensity of someone who understood that there was no backup plan. I was accepted to 4 schools. Northwestern offered me a full academic scholarship. My parents took me out to dinner at the Olive Garden on Western Avenue to celebrate. Brandon, who had failed 2 classes that semester, was not mentioned at the table that evening. Neither were his grades when he graduated 2 years later with a 2.1 GPA, and my parents threw him a party in the backyard with a rented tent and a catered spread that cost more than my entire first semester's worth of textbooks. Law school was harder. The scholarship covered Northwestern for undergrad, but the University of Chicago Law School was a different landscape entirely. I took out federal loans for the first year. I worked as a research assistant for 2 different professors simultaneously. On weekends, I picked up shifts at a corporate catering company, carrying trays through the kind of downtown events that I told myself I would one day attend as a guest. I did not tell my parents about the loans. I did not tell them about the catering shifts. When my mother called on Sunday evenings and asked how things were going, I told her things were fine. She always seemed relieved to hear it, and moved the conversation quickly to whatever Brandon was going through that week. By the time I passed the bar exam and accepted an associate position at Harrington & Cole, one of the most respected corporate litigation firms in the city, I had accumulated $41,000 in student debt that I paid off entirely within 3 years on my own salary. My parents attended my bar swearing-in ceremony. My mother wore her good church dress. My father shook my hand and told me he was proud of me. And I believed him, because in that moment, I think he genuinely was. None of that erased the bicycle. None of it erased the tent in the backyard. But I had made peace with it, the way you make peace with things you cannot change, not by resolving them, but by building your life large enough that they no longer define the shape of it. That was what I told myself anyway, until 6 months ago. The key ceremony. That was what my mother called it. The key ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in October at the house on Maple Ridge Drive in Memphis. I had driven down the night before and stayed at a hotel near the interstate because the house was meant to be a surprise, and I wanted my parents to see it for the first time, together with me, standing at the door holding the keys. My father walked through every room without saying much. He touched the countertops and the door frames. The way a man touches things he is afraid might disappear if he holds on too hard. My mother stood in the middle of the kitchen and pressed both hands flat against the marble island and looked out the window at the backyard and said very quietly that she had never, in her life, expected anything like this. I had not cried in a professional setting in 11 years. I came close that morning. What I did not expect was Brandon. He arrived 40 minutes late, which was consistent with his entire life history, and he brought with him a man I had never met, tall, well-dressed, in the particular way that men dress when they want to appear more successful than they are, with the kind of easy smile that moves faster than it should across a stranger's face. Brandon introduced him only as a friend, which was not an introduction at all. The man shook my hand, said something complimentary about the property, and then spent the next 20 minutes moving through the rooms with an attention that felt less like admiration and more like assessment. I noticed it. I filed it away. I told myself it meant nothing. But it was Brandon's expression that stayed with me long after I drove back to Chicago that evening. He stood in the doorway of the living room with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the space I had designed and funded and built from nothing. and his face held something I had never seen there before. It was not quite envy. It was something quieter and more settled than envy. Brandon looked at that house, the way a man looks at something he believes is already his. I remember thinking it was just jealousy. I was wrong. The first rule of litigation is simple. You never show your hand until the moment it ends them. I learned that lesson in my second year of practice, sitting across a conference table from a senior partner who had spent 30 years disassembling people's carefully constructed lies in front of judges and juries. He told me that the most dangerous thing an attorney can do is react too early. React too early, and you reveal what you know. You give the other side time to adjust, to cover their tracks, to build a story that accounts for your evidence. But wait until every piece is in place, until the folder is so thick and so airtight that there is nowhere left to run, and you do not win the argument. You end it. I had been practicing that particular form of patience for 14 years. The morning after the third fraud alert, I placed a call to Marcus Webb, a former investigative journalist turned private investigator who had worked exclusively with my firm for the past 6 years. Marcus was not the kind of man who asked unnecessary questions or offered unnecessary opinions. He was methodical, discreet, and possessed of an almost unsettling ability to locate information that most people believed was buried beyond finding. I had referred to him in depositions carefully and without attribution as my best resource. That was not an exaggeration. I gave Marcus one assignment: find out everything there was to know about the man Brandon had brought to the key ceremony in Memphis 6 months ago. I described him in detail: the height, the expensive but not quite right suit, the smile that arrived ahead of any reasonable cause for it, the way he had moved through the rooms of my parents' house, like someone conducting an inventory rather than admiring a home. Marcus called me back in 4 days. The man's name was Kyle Patterson. He was 38 years old, originally from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and had been operating as a licensed real estate broker in the greater Nashville area for the past 7 years. Or rather, he had held a license. The Tennessee Real Estate Commission had placed that license under formal review 18 months ago, following a complaint filed by a retired schoolteacher in Knoxville who alleged that Patterson had fraudulently represented ownership documents on a property she had contracted to purchase. The case had not resulted in a conviction. The schoolteacher had been elderly, the paperwork had been complicated, and Patterson had retained an attorney skilled enough to introduce sufficient ambiguity into the proceedings that the matter had ultimately been resolved without criminal charges. It was not the first time. 3 years before the Knoxville situation, a couple in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville had filed a civil complaint against Patterson, alleging that he had collected a substantial earnest money deposit on a property he did not have legal authorization to sell. That case had also dissolved before reaching a verdict this time, because the couple had accepted a private settlement rather than endure the cost and duration of continued litigation. Patterson had walked away from both situations with his freedom intact, and apparently his appetite for other people's assets completely undiminished. Marcus included in his report a photograph taken outside a coffee shop in Midtown Memphis. Brandon, seated at an outdoor table, Patterson across from him, both of them leaning over what appeared to be a spread of documents. The photograph was dated 11 days after the key ceremony, which meant that whatever arrangement existed between my brother and Kyle Patterson had not begun casually or spontaneously. It had been in motion almost from the moment I handed my parents those keys. The week after Marcus delivered his initial report, my firm's in-house technology consultant, a quiet, precise woman named Elaine, who handled our secure digital forensics work, identified the existence of an email chain between an address registered to Brandon and a separate address registered to a property consulting LLC, that upon further examination traced directly back to Patterson. The chain contained dozens of messages exchanged over a period of approximately 4 months. I did not read them yet, not because I was not ready to know what they said, but because I wanted to be in the right frame of mind when I did. In litigation, The sequence in which you absorb information matters almost as much as the information itself. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I looked directly at its center. So I waited. And while I waited, I called my mother every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, the way I had called her every Sunday evening for the past 11 years. I asked about her garden. I asked whether the new neighbors on the left side of Maple Ridge had introduced themselves yet. I asked whether my father's lower back had been bothering him less since he started using the custom chair I had ordered for his woodworking studio. My mother answered each question in the unhurried, pleasant tone she always used on Sunday evenings, and I listened, and I responded, and I gave absolutely nothing away. On the third Sunday, she mentioned almost in passing that Brandon had been spending a lot of time in Memphis lately. She said it the way you say things you want someone to ask about. I told her that was nice, that it was good he was staying connected, and then I asked about the roses she had planted along the back fence in September. She told me they were coming in beautifully. I told her I was glad to hear it. After I hung up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked at the folder sitting on the corner of my desk. Marcus's photographs, Elaine's technical report, Patterson's regulatory history. 3 weeks of evidence assembled with the same quiet, unhurried precision I brought to every case that mattered. The folder was almost ready. Almost. 3 weeks of evidence. 3 weeks of Sunday phone calls where I asked my mother how her garden was doing while my investigator photographed her son meeting with a known con man. The folder on my desk was almost ready. Almost. Then my father texted me. Just 4 words. Come home this Sunday. I read the message 3 times, sitting at my kitchen counter on a Thursday evening. My father was 68 years old and had only learned to use a smartphone 2 years ago. A text message from Robert Reeves unprompted on a Thursday night was not an ordinary occurrence. I booked the flight that same night. Not because he asked, but because 3 weeks of photographs and regulatory filings had reached the point where reading about Kyle Patterson was no longer sufficient. I needed to be in the same room as him. I needed to watch him move and speak and interact with my family in real time, the way I watched witnesses in deposition, looking not just at what they said, but at everything they did not say. I landed in Memphis on Saturday afternoon. I stopped at a bakery on Beale Street on the way, a place my mother had loved for 20 years, and picked up her favorite lemon pound cake, boxed and tied with a yellow ribbon. A prop, a very delicious prop. The house on Maple Ridge looked exactly as it had 6 months ago. The wraparound porch still immaculate, the oak trees just beginning to shed their leaves, the flower beds along the walkway tended with the careful attention my mother gave to everything she loved. I stood there for a moment before ringing the bell, taking in the property the way I had not allowed myself to since the fraud alerts began. My mother opened the door before I could ring. She looked pleased to see me in the way that contained something else, underneath a brightness, working slightly too hard. The way brightness does when it is covering ground. It does not want you to examine. She took the cake box, said something warm, and ushered me inside. The dining room table had been set for 6. I counted the place settings twice. My parents, Brandon, myself, and 2 additional settings that had not been explained in any invitation I received. I did not ask. I accepted the glass of sweet tea my father pressed into my hands and followed him to the living room. We talked for 20 minutes about his woodworking projects and the neighbor's dog and the Memphis weather. My father was quieter than usual, and his eyes, when they met mine, held something careful and tired that I filed away without comment. Kyle Patterson arrived at 5:20. He came through the front door with the ease of a man who had been given a key, whether literally or simply by virtue of the particular brand of entitlement some men carry so naturally, it reads as permission. I could not yet determine. Brandon was with him mid-conversation and laughing until they registered my presence. The laughter stopped. Patterson recovered first. He crossed the room, extended his hand, introduced himself with a smile that was practiced and warm, and revealed absolutely nothing. I shook his hand and told him it was nice to meet him. Neither of us meant a word of it. Over the next 2 hours, I watched Patterson conduct what I can only describe as a quiet, deliberate occupation of my parents' home. He knew where the wine was kept. He went directly to the cabinet beneath the kitchen island without asking. He knew my father preferred his coffee with 1 sugar and no cream. He prepared it without being told and delivered it to the armchair where my father always sat. He referenced a conversation he and my mother had apparently shared the previous week about the back fence, which meant he had been inside this house at least once in the past 7 days without my knowledge. He spoke about the property with an ease that no guest should possess. He mentioned the square footage of the primary bedroom unprompted. He referenced assessed values of comparable properties in the Maple Ridge area with the casual authority of someone who had looked it up recently and for a specific reason. Every time Patterson spoke about the house, I watched my parents. My father developed an intense interest in the grain of the dining table. My mother moved to the kitchen and occupied herself with dishes that did not need attending. They were not unaware of what was unfolding in their own home. They were choosing not to witness it in front of me, which was an entirely different and far more significant thing. I excused myself after the salad course. The guest bathroom at the end of the hallway had extra soundproofing I had specified that during construction, thinking of my father's early morning schedule. I closed the door, turned on the faucet, and stood in front of the mirror. I counted to 10, the way I counted in courtrooms when something unexpected happened that I had not prepared for. Slowly, deliberately, until my breathing matched the rhythm of the count, and the rhythm steadied everything else. Then I dried my hands on the monogrammed towel I had personally selected for this bathroom and walked back down the hallway. I picked up my fork. I looked across the table at Kyle Patterson. He was already watching me, and when our eyes met, he smiled, the same practiced, hollow expression he had offered when we shook hands 3 hours earlier. I smiled back. Neither of us meant it. Monday morning, Chicago. I opened Kyle Patterson's email chain for the first time and read every single word. I had printed the entire chain the night before Elaine, my firm's digital forensics consultant, had compiled and formatted it into a single document that ran to 63 pages. I sat at my desk with a fresh legal pad, a red pen, and a cup of coffee, and I read with the same focused attention I brought to the most consequential documents of my professional life, which as of that morning, this was. The earliest message in the chain was dated 7 months ago, 1 month before the key ceremony in Memphis. That detail stopped me. I set my pen down and read the date again. 7 months ago, Kyle Patterson had initiated contact with my brother through what appeared to be a casual professional inquiry, a message sent to an email address Brandon used for his occasional freelance landscaping work, expressing interest in discussing a business opportunity in the Memphis area real estate market. 7 months ago, I had still been in the final planning stages of the Memphis house construction. The property had not yet been completed. My parents had not yet been told about it. Someone had known about that house before my parents did. I picked my pen back up and kept reading. The early messages were unremarkable on their surface. Patterson presenting himself as a boutique real estate consultant, looking to identify off-market investment opportunities in the greater Memphis area. Brandon responding with the eager, slightly breathless energy of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to tell him he has business instincts worth developing. They met for coffee twice. They talked on the phone regularly. Patterson was patient, attentive, and generous with his time, in the way that people are generous when they are building towards something specific. The shift came in the 4th week of their correspondence. Patterson began asking questions about my parents, carefully, indirectly framed as casual conversation. How long had they lived in Memphis? Were they settled in the neighborhood? Did they own their property outright or carry a mortgage? Brandon answered everything openly, with the unguarded candor of someone who did not understand that information has value and that giving it away freely is its own kind of loss. Then Patterson asked about me. He asked about my profession, my firm, my client base. He asked how long I had been practicing. He asked, with what must have seemed like idle curiosity, whether I maintained any private real estate holdings under a separate corporate structure. Brandon, who had attended my firm's 10-year anniversary reception 2 years prior and had heard me mention Sterling Property LLC in passing conversation, told him everything he wanted to know. I set the printed pages down on my desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Kyle Patterson had not stumbled into my family. He had researched my firm, identified me as a target, located my brother as the most accessible point of entry, and spent 4 weeks cultivating that entry point before he ever mentioned the property. By the time Brandon brought him to the key ceremony in October, Patterson already knew the address, the assessed value, the ownership structure, and almost certainly the refinancing potential of a property he had never legally set foot inside. I returned to the document. The later messages were considerably less subtle. Beginning in the second month of their correspondence, Patterson began laying out what he framed as a collaborative investment strategy, a way he explained to Brandon for the family to access the equity built into the Maple Ridge property without going through the primary owner. He used language that was deliberately technical and reassuring, in equal measure the way people use language when they want to make something that is not legitimate sound merely complicated. He instructed Brandon across a series of messages sent over 3 weeks on precisely how to initiate a refinancing application using a power of attorney claim. He explained which documents would be required, how the ownership records could be navigated, and what language to use when speaking to bank representatives to avoid triggering an immediate review. He was thorough, he was specific, and he was, I noted, always careful to frame his instructions as suggestions, guidance offered to a willing partner, rather than directives issued to someone he was using as a tool. The distinction would matter very little in a courtroom. The final phase of Patterson's plan, outlined across the last dozen messages in the chain, was the part that he had been careful never to discuss with Brandon directly over the telephone, which told me he understood at some level that what he was describing crossed a line he preferred not to have recorded in his own voice. Once the refinancing funds cleared $300,000 drawn against the property's equity, Patterson intended to immediately assign the loan contract to a shell company registered in Delaware under a name that had no traceable connection to him. The funds would move through 2 additional intermediary accounts before reaching a destination that Elaine had flagged as likely located outside domestic jurisdiction. Brandon's name would remain on every document. Patterson's would appear nowhere. The last message in the chain was sent 9 days ago. It was 4 sentences long. Patterson told Brandon that the application was progressing well, that the timeline remained on track, and that Brandon should avoid any direct communication with the primary account holder, meaning me, until the process was complete. The final sentence read, "Trust the plan. You've earned this." I closed the folder. I sat very still for a long time, looking at the city outside my window. Kyle Patterson had constructed something careful and deliberate and designed to leave my brother holding every consequence, while he walked away with everything of value. It was not a scheme born of desperation. It was the work of someone who had done this before, who had refined the method across 2 previous attempts, and who had selected his target not randomly, but with the specific, calculated patience of a man who understood exactly what he was looking for. Kyle Patterson did not choose my family because he knew Brandon. He chose my family because he knew me. He had been watching Sterling Law Associates for months before he ever walked into my parents' home. I called my father on a Thursday evening, 4 weeks after the first fraud alert. I didn't mention Kyle. I didn't mention Brandon. I just asked him one question. The call was not impulsive. I had been considering it for 3 days, weighing it the way I weighed every decision that carried real consequence, turning it over in my mind, examining it from every angle, identifying the risks of acting against the risks of waiting. The email chain had given me the full architecture of what Patterson had built and what my brother had agreed to participate in. What it had not given me was something I found I needed more than I had expected to need it. I needed to know how much my father knew. I was sitting in the small reading room, off my bedroom, a space I had furnished with 2 armchairs and a floor lamp, and approximately 400 books, the room in my apartment that felt most like the version of myself I was before I became the version that existed in courtrooms and conference rooms. I had changed out of my work clothes. I was wearing old socks and a graduate school sweatshirt that had lost its shape sometime around 2014, and that I had never been able to bring myself to replace. I had a cup of chamomile tea on the side table that I was not drinking. I dialed my father's number at 7:15. He answered on the 3rd ring, which was his habit, never the 1st, which he considered presumptuous, never past the 4th, which he considered rude. 38 years of that same rhythm. Some people's consistency is the most reliable thing about them. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. His voice was the same voice. It had always been low and measured with the particular warmth that my father reserved for his private moments, the warmth that never quite made it into public spaces, where he felt he needed to present himself as more formal than he naturally was. "How are you doing up there?" "I'm well, Dad," I said. "Staying busy." I asked about his back, whether the new cushion I had ordered for his workshop stool had arrived yet. He said it had, that it made a real difference on the long afternoons. We talked for a few minutes about nothing consequential. The weather turning colder, a documentary series he had been watching in the evenings, whether the pecan tree in the backyard was going to need trimming before winter. I let the conversation find its own pace. I did not rush it. And then, in the space between one ordinary topic and the next, I asked him, "Dad," I said, keeping my voice entirely level, "has anything unusual been happening with the house paperwork lately? Any documents come through that seemed out of the ordinary?" The silence that followed was not long, in absolute terms, perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. But in the context of a conversation that had been moving along with easy, comfortable rhythm, 4 or 5 seconds of silence from Robert Reeves was the equivalent of a full confession. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not dramatically. My father was not a dramatic man, but the warmth had pulled back slightly, replaced by something more careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with more deliberation than the question seemed to warrant. "There have been some things," he said. "Some paperwork Brandon's been handling." He paused. "Your mother's been dealing with most of it." I kept my voice easy and unhurried. "What kind of paperwork?" Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear him shifting in his chair, the particular creak of the workshop stool I had replaced for him twice over the years, because he refused to sit anywhere else when he was on the phone. He said he was not entirely sure of the details, that Brandon had mentioned something about refinancing, about accessing some of the equity in the property for a business venture, that Gloria had told him it was all being handled properly, and that he should not worry about it. He said the last part quietly. The way people say things, they already know, they should have questioned and didn't. "Did Brandon explain what the business venture was?" I asked. "No," my father said. And then after another pause that carried its own particular weight, I didn't ask. Those 3 words landed in the space between us and stayed there. I did not fill the silence that came after them. I had learned long ago that silence used correctly does more useful work than any question. My father was not a man who could sit comfortably inside an uncomfortable silence. He would fill it himself, and whatever he chose to fill it with would be more honest than anything he produced in response to a direct question. He did not disappoint me. He told me slowly, and in pieces, that Brandon had been coming around the house more frequently over the past several months. That he had brought a friend with him. On several occasions, a man in the real estate business who had been very helpful. Gloria said very knowledgeable about property values in the area. That there had been some documents for my mother to look over. Things that Gloria had handled without troubling him with the specifics, because, as she had explained, he worried too much, and it was all perfectly straightforward. He said straightforward, the way people say it when they are not sure it is true, but have decided they would rather believe it than investigate the alternative. "Dad," I said gently, "did Mom mention my name in connection with any of these documents?" The silence this time was different, heavier. The silence of a man arriving at a door he had been walking toward for some time, and finding now that he was standing in front of it, that he did not particularly want to open it. "She might have," he said finally. His voice had gone very quiet. "Diana, are you in trouble?" I looked across my reading room at the books on the opposite wall. 14 years of cases and contracts and constitutional arguments, the accumulated evidence of everything I had built, by myself for myself, without asking anyone to carry any part of it for me. "No, Dad," I said. "But I need you to think very carefully about whether you are." The line went silent for so long, I thought he had hung up. My mother required a different approach entirely. Words didn't work on Gloria Reeves. Evidence did. I drove down to Memphis on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. That was intentional. Gloria was a woman who prepared for confrontation, the way some people prepared for company. She tidied everything up, arranged her defenses, and presented you with a version of the situation that had been carefully edited before you arrived. I had watched her do it my entire life, and I had no interest in giving her the opportunity to do it now. The drive from Chicago takes approximately 6 hours on a clear day. I left at 4 in the morning, stopped once for coffee and fuel outside of Nashville, and pulled into the Maple Ridge driveway at 10:15. The neighborhood was quiet in the particular way that Saturday mornings in well-kept suburban communities are quiet. A lawnmower running 2 streets over, a child on a bicycle at the far end of the block, the unhurried pace of people who believed their lives were proceeding according to plan. I sat in the car for 2 minutes, not from hesitation, from habit. I had learned years ago that the 2 minutes before a difficult conversation were the most valuable investment of time available to me. I used them to decide precisely, and finally, what I was and was not willing to accept from the next hour. Then I got out of the car, walked up the porch steps, and knocked. My mother answered the door in her gardening clothes, worn canvas gloves, a faded apron over her church day dress, a streak of soil along her left forearm that told me she had been out back with her roses before I arrived. She looked at me the way people look at things that arrive without warning and require immediate recalibration. The surprise lasted approximately 1 second before her expression settled into something more familiar and considerably less welcoming. I did not give her time to set the terms of the conversation. "I came to talk," I said. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the doorway without answering, which was as close to an invitation as I was going to get. I followed her into the living room, the same room where 6 months ago she had stood beside my father and accepted the keys to a home that I had spent the better part of a year building for them. The furniture I had selected was still arranged exactly as I had arranged it. The curtains I had hung were still catching the morning light the way I had imagined they would when I chose the fabric. Everything looked exactly as it should have. Nothing was. Gloria sat in the armchair nearest the window and folded her hands in her lap with the particular composure of a woman who has decided she will not be the first one to speak. So I spoke. I told her I had driven 6 hours to have a conversation I could not have over the telephone. I told her I was not there to argue, not there to make accusations, and not there to discuss what should or should not have been done differently over the past several months. I told her I had one thing I needed her to see, and that after she saw it, she could say whatever she needed to say, and I would listen. She said nothing. Her chin lifted slightly. "That was Gloria Reeves, for you may proceed." I opened my laptop on the coffee table between us. I had the document pulled up and ready the specific section of the email chain I needed highlighted in the pale yellow of my annotation software. I turned the screen to face her and waited while she read. Then I read it aloud anyway, because I wanted to be certain she heard every word and could not later claim she had misread or misunderstood. "Cut the old lady and her husband loose once the money clears," I said, keeping my voice completely even. "They're dead weight." The room was very quiet. Gloria's eyes were still on the screen. She had not moved since I began reading, not her hands, not her posture, not the careful arrangement of her expression. But something was changing anyway, the way temperature changes in a room before anyone thinks to check the thermostat. I watched it happen in the small muscles around her eyes, in the almost imperceptible loosening of the set of her jaw. I let the silence work. I did not fill it, because here was the thing about Gloria Reeves that I had understood since I was old enough to understand anything about her. She was not a cruel woman. She was a proud woman who had spent 30 years making decisions based on a hierarchy of love that placed Brandon at the center and arranged everyone else around him at varying distances. She had told herself, and told it convincingly enough that she believed it, that every choice she made in service of that hierarchy was an act of devotion rather than an act of harm. Kyle Patterson had written 7 words that made that story impossible to keep telling. Cut the old lady and her husband loose. Dead weight. The man she had allowed into the home I built for her. The man whose presence she had accommodated, and whose access she had facilitated, and whose plan she had chosen not to examine too carefully, because examining it would have required her to ask questions she did not want answered. That man had looked at her and her husband, at Robert with his workshop and his bad knees and his 30 years of honest labor, and had seen nothing worth keeping. My mother looked at the screen for a long time. When she finally looked up at me, something in her face had shifted. Not guilt, not yet, but the first crack in a wall she had been building for 30 years. Friday morning, I walked into my office, closed the door, and began dismantling everything Kyle Patterson had spent months building in a single business day. I want to be precise about what that morning felt like, because I think people sometimes imagine that moments of decisive action arrive wrapped in drama. Elevated heart rate, trembling hands, the cinematic weight of a consequential choice being made in real time. That was not my experience. By the time I sat down at my desk that Friday and opened my case file, every decision had already been made. The thinking was done. What remained was execution. And execution, in my experience, feels less like a dramatic moment and more like the quiet, methodical satisfaction of a well-organized task list being worked through from top to bottom. I started with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My firm maintained a working relationship with the Financial Crimes Division of the Chicago Field Office, a professional connection built over years of corporate fraud litigation that had occasionally required coordination between private counsel and federal investigators. I placed a call to a supervisory agent I had worked with twice before, a methodical woman named Sandra Okafor, who had a reputation for reading evidentiary packages quickly and accurately. I told her I had a matter involving interstate financial fraud, document falsification, and a subject with a documented history of similar conduct in 2 other jurisdictions. I told her I would be sending a complete evidentiary package within the hour. I sent it in 40 minutes, 63 pages of email correspondence, Marcus Webb's investigative report, including the photographs, and the regulatory history from Tennessee, Elaine's technical analysis of the digital forensics, a 3-page cover memorandum I had drafted the previous evening, laying out the timeline, the methodology, and the relevant federal statutes. Everything organized, indexed, and cross-referenced, the way I organized every document package I sent to people whose time I respected and whose attention I needed. Agent Okafor acknowledged receipt within the hour. She said she would be in touch. I moved to the next item. Sterling Property, LLC, the holding company through which I owned the Maple Ridge property, had been established 4 years ago, with the assistance of a corporate attorney named Harold Finch, who had spent 30 years structuring private asset protection agreements for high net worth individuals, and who had insisted, when we drafted the operating agreement, on including a series of protective clauses that I had approved without fully anticipating the specific circumstances under which I would one day need them. One of those clauses allowed the sole managing member of the LLCC, which was me, to place an immediate administrative hold on all transactions, transfers, or encumbrances associated with any property held under the company's name, effective upon written notice to the registered agent. I drafted that notice in 11 minutes. I sent it electronically to Harold's office and followed it with a phone call to confirm receipt and instruct him to file the hold with the county recorder's office in Shelby County, Tennessee, before the close of business that day. Harold, who had heard a great deal across 30 years of practice and had developed the professional composure to match asked only 2 clarifying questions before telling me it would be done. It was done by noon. At 12:30, I called Patricia at First Federal Mortgage Services, the same banker who had confirmed Brandon's name on the refinancing application 5 weeks earlier, and informed her that I was placing a formal creditor hold on the Maple Ridge account, pending a fraud investigation being conducted in coordination with federal authorities. I provided her with the case reference number Agent Okafor's office had assigned to the evidentiary package. Patricia processed the hold while I was still on the line. The refinancing application, which had been sitting in an advanced processing queue for the better part of 2 weeks, was flagged, suspended, and referred to the bank's internal fraud review unit within the same afternoon. That left the notification. I had considered at various points over the preceding weeks whether to call my family before taking legal action, whether to offer a warning, a final opportunity to reverse course, some gesture toward the possibility that things might be resolved without the involvement of federal investigators and court filings. I had turned that consideration over carefully and arrived at the same conclusion each time. A warning was not something I owed to people who had chosen with full awareness of what they were doing to proceed without offering me the same courtesy. I drafted the legal notification myself. It was formal, precise, and entirely devoid of personal language. A document that communicated in the measured vocabulary of civil and criminal procedure that the transaction currently being pursued in connection with the Maple Ridge property had been identified as potentially fraudulent, that relevant authorities had been notified, that all associated financial instruments had been placed under administrative hold, and that any further action taken in connection with the property would be considered an aggravating factor in any subsequent legal proceedings. I addressed it to the Maple Ridge Drive property. I sent it certified mail with electronic confirmation, and I also had Harold's office transmit a copy via formal legal notice to the address on file with the county recorder. I did not call. I did not send a personal message. I did not explain. At 4:47 that afternoon, my phone showed a notification from the financial monitoring service I had set up on the LLC accounts. Kyle Patterson's associated consulting entity, the LLC that Elaine had traced back to him during her digital forensics review, had attempted a transaction that morning and been declined. The account had been flagged. A second attempt had been made at 2:15 and declined again. At 4:30, the account had been formally frozen pending review. I sat back in my chair and looked out at the city in the late afternoon light. 34 floors below Chicago was doing what Chicago always did at the end of a work week, shedding the weight of the hours that had just passed, people moving faster on the sidewalks, the particular restless energy of a city, ready to stop being productive and start being something else. I thought about Kyle Patterson, sitting somewhere in Nashville or Memphis or wherever he had chosen to spend his Friday, opening a notification on his phone and reading words that told him for the first time that the ground beneath his carefully constructed plan was no longer solid. I imagine he stared at that notification for a long time before he understood what it meant. By the time he did, it was already too late to run. My brother called 17 times between Friday night and Saturday morning. I let every call go to voicemail. On Sunday, his attorney contacted mine. That was when I answered. The calls had started at 9:47 Friday evening, approximately 5 hours after Kyle Patterson's accounts were frozen, and continued at irregular intervals through the night and into Saturday morning, the spacing between them growing longer as the hours passed, in the particular rhythm of a man who keeps reaching for a solution and finding the same closed door each time. I did not listen to the voicemails. I did not need to. I already knew with reasonable precision what Brandon was experiencing on the other end of those unanswered calls, and I had made a deliberate decision that his experience of those hours was a necessary part of what came next. On Sunday afternoon, a message arrived through my firm's main contact line from an attorney named Gerald Park, who identified himself as having been recently retained to advise Brandon Reeves in connection with a matter involving federal financial regulations. Gerald Park was a competent criminal defense attorney based in Memphis with a reasonable track record in white-collar cases. I had looked him up within 30 seconds of receiving his message, because that was the kind of thing I did automatically and without thinking about it. The fact that Brandon had found competent representation over a weekend told me two things: that he had taken the situation seriously enough to act quickly, and that someone, possibly my father, had helped him do it. I called Brandon directly, not through Gerald Park. Brandon picked up before the first ring had finished. Diana. His voice was hoarse, in the way voices get when they have been in use for a long time, under conditions of sustained distress. Diana, I need you to tell me what is happening. I have been trying to reach you since Friday, and nobody will tell me anything. And Kyle is not. Brandon, I said. His name said quietly and without inflection was enough to stop him. I need you to listen to me carefully. Can you do that? A pause. Then, yes. I told him everything. Not because I owed it to him. I had spent considerable time over the preceding weeks examining the question of what precisely I owed my brother, and had arrived at a figure considerably smaller than what I was about to give him. I told him because Gerald Park had contacted my attorney, which meant Brandon had crossed a threshold from passive participant to active legal subject, and because what happened in the next 24 hours would determine the difference between a man who cooperated with a federal investigation and a man who did not. And that difference, in my professional experience, was the difference between a difficult few years and a genuinely destroyed life. I told him about Kyle Patterson's history in Nashville and Knoxville. I told him about the two prior schemes, the civil settlements, the regulatory proceedings, that had ended without conviction because the victims had not had the resources or the documentation to pursue them to their conclusion. I told him about the shell company in Delaware, about the intermediary accounts, about the offshore destination that Elaine had flagged in her forensic analysis. I told him about the final phase of the plan, the part Kyle had been careful never to put in writing in his own name, in which the funds would move, and Kyle would vanish, and every document in the transaction would bear Brandon's signature, and Brandon's name, and Brandon's liability. You were going to be the only person left standing when it was over, I said, and you were going to be standing in front of a federal prosecutor. The silence on the other end of the line was different from my father's silence or my mother's silence. Those silences had been the silences of people managing information they already partly knew. Brandon's silence was the silence of someone encountering, for the first time and all at once, the full dimensions of something they had walked into, with their eyes not quite open. Diana. His voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. I didn't know. About Nashville. About any of that. He told me it was a legitimate investment. He said you would never notice until it was already done, and by then, he stopped. By then, it wouldn't matter, because you'd just be angry, and eventually, you'd get over it. That's what he said, that you'd get over it. I did not respond to that. There was nothing useful to say about it, that the situation was not already saying more eloquently than I could. What do I do? Brandon asked. You have 24 hours, I said. Within that window, you contact Agent Sandra Okafor at the Chicago field office of the FBI. Gerald Park can facilitate that contact, and you tell her that you wish to cooperate fully with the investigation. You provide everything you have, every message, every document, every conversation you can recall. You do not minimize. You do not omit. You do not ask for anything in return before you have given everything you have to give. Cooperation at this stage, offered voluntarily and completely, is the single most significant factor in determining how this proceeds for you. Another silence. Shorter this time. Will you represent me? He asked. His voice in that moment sounded nothing like the 32-year-old man who had stood in my parents' living room and laughed too loudly at his own jokes and let Kyle Patterson refill his glass all evening. It sounded like a much younger version of someone I had once known better than I knew him now. Will you be my lawyer? I looked across my apartment at the window. The city outside was doing its ordinary Sunday evening things, indifferent and continuous, and entirely unaware of the conversation taking place 34 floors above its sidewalks. No, I said, but I'll find you someone good. I ended the call. I did not move for a while after that. I sat in the chair by the window with the phone in my hand and the city going quietly about its business outside the glass, and I let myself feel, without analyzing or managing it, the full complicated weight of what it meant to love someone and be failed by them, and still after everything, not want to watch them destroyed. Brandon was not innocent, but he was my brother. And somewhere, in the painful distance between those two facts, lived the last complicated piece of what I still felt for my family. I sat in the dark for a long time. Kyle Patterson was arrested on a Saturday morning at Nashville International Airport. Gate B14, one-way ticket to Cancun. I learned about the arrest from Agent Okafor, who called my cell at 11:40 on a Saturday morning while I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a brief I had been trying to read for the better part of an hour without retaining much of it. She delivered the information in the economical, unhurried manner of someone who had made this kind of call many times before and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. Patterson had been identified at the departure gate during a routine document check. He had been carrying 3 prepaid cellular devices, $40,000 in domestic currency, distributed across 2 money belts beneath his clothing, and a passport issued under a name that was not his own. The last item Agent Okafor noted was what investigators referred to as a significant aggravating factor. He had been planning this for longer than anyone had realized. The search of Patterson's Nashville apartment, conducted under warrant the following Monday, produced what Agent Okafor described in her subsequent report as a comprehensive operational archive files, both physical and digital, documenting not only the Maple Ridge transaction, but 4 additional schemes, conducted across Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina over the preceding 6 years. The victims included a retired postal worker in Asheville, a recently widowed woman in Savannah who had been in the process of settling her late husband's estate, a young couple in Knoxville who had spent 3 years saving for their first property, and a church deacon in Murfreesboro who had been attempting to refinance a building his congregation had owned for 40 years. None of them had had the documentation, the resources, or the professional connections to bring what had happened to them to a federal level. Patterson had understood that when he selected them. He had understood it when he selected my family, too. The difference this time was me. Brandon, true to the 24-hour window I had given him, had contacted Agent Okafor's office through Gerald Park on Monday morning. His cooperation was described by the federal prosecutor's office as substantial and materially useful. He provided complete records of every communication with Patterson, a detailed account of every conversation they had conducted in person, and a voluntary written statement that left nothing relevant unaddressed. The prosecutor's office, in acknowledgement of that cooperation, agreed to a significantly reduced charge that would carry considerably less consequence than what Brandon would have faced had he waited to be compelled. I had not spoken to Brandon again since the Sunday phone call. I did not know at that point whether I would, but I noted the cooperation. I noted that he had used the window I had given him, and I filed that fact away in the part of my mind where I kept things I was not yet ready to decide what to do with. 6 weeks after the arrest, I received a formal subpoena to testify as a witness for the prosecution. I was not surprised. The evidentiary package I had submitted to Agent Okafor was the foundation of the federal case, and the prosecutor, a methodical, unhurried woman named Claudette Marsh, who had spent 20 years in the Financial Crimes Division and who reminded me, in the best possible way, of every senior partner I had ever respected, wanted me on the record to authenticate the documentation and establish the timeline of discovery. I prepared for my testimony the way I prepared for every appearance that mattered. I reviewed every document in the package. I constructed a precise chronological account of each step of my investigation, from the first fraud alert to the morning I transmitted the package to Agent Okafor's office. I anticipated every question Claudette Marsh might ask, and every line of cross-examination that Patterson's defense counsel might pursue. And I prepared a clear, complete, and entirely unassailable answer to each one. The morning of my testimony was a Tuesday in late November. The federal courthouse in Nashville was a gray stone building that took the cold light of an overcast morning and did nothing to soften it. I arrived 40 minutes early, reviewed my notes in a small anteroom off the main corridor, and walked into the courtroom when my name was called, with the same measured pace I used to walk into every room where something important was about to happen. I did not look at Patterson when I took the witness stand. Not because I was avoiding him, but because there was no strategic reason to look at him yet. And I had learned over 14 years of litigation that attention, like everything else, should be deployed with intention rather than impulse. I answered Claudette Marsh's questions for 40 minutes. I was direct, precise, and completely consistent. The same answer, the third time it was asked as the first, because there was only one true account of what had happened, and I knew it without effort or embellishment. Patterson's defense counsel cross-examined me for 22 minutes and did not find a single point of meaningful vulnerability because there was none to find. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I finally looked at him. Kyle Patterson was sitting at the defense table in a suit that was slightly too large for him, the shoulders dropping in a way that suggested he had lost weight since the suit was purchased, which told me the preceding weeks had not been comfortable ones. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized from cross-examinations I had conducted over the years, the expression of someone who has been comprehensively outmaneuvered and is still, even now, in the process of fully understanding how it happened. I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough for him to understand that I had seen him clearly, from the very beginning, in my parents' dining room, across that carefully set table, behind that practiced and empty smile, and that nothing about any of it had ever gone the way he had intended. Then I looked away and walked toward the gallery doors. Behind me, Claudette Marsh rose to deliver her closing remarks. I heard her begin as I reached the door, measured and unhurried, building her case the way good prosecutors always build their cases, from the ground up and with no gaps left unfilled. 3 weeks later, the jury returned. Claudette Marsh called me when the verdict came in. She read the counts aloud over the phone, and I sat at my desk and listened. And when she finished, I thanked her and told her it had been a privilege to work with her office. 8 counts. The judge read each one into the record, and I was told afterward, by someone who had been in the room, that with each count, Kyle Patterson's shoulders dropped a fraction further, as though the weight of each number was a physical thing being added to what he was already carrying. By the 8th, he looked like a man who finally understood that the game was over. 2 weeks before sentencing, my father called, not to ask for anything, not to explain himself. He called to tell me he had already contacted the prosecutor's office. I was stepping out of a conference room when his name appeared on my personal line. I answered immediately. He did not say hello. He said, "I called that prosecutor woman. I told her I wanted to give a statement. I'm going to testify at the sentencing. I wanted you to know before it happened." I stood in the hallway, without speaking for a moment. Why, I asked. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. And then, after a pause that carried the weight of a man, choosing his words with more care than he had chosen some of the most consequential words of his life, "Because I stood by when I should not have stood by, and I cannot stand before the Lord carrying that. I am 68 years old. I do not have the years left to hold what I did not do. I did not respond immediately. Some things, when they finally arrive, after a very long wait, require a moment of stillness before they can be properly received. Tell me everything, I said, from the beginning. And he did. He told me Gloria had come to him 4 months before the fraud alerts began and said Brandon had found a legitimate business arrangement involving the Maple Ridge property. She told him the contact was a professional, that Diana would understand once it was done. He had asked one question, does Diana know? Gloria told him Diana would be informed at the appropriate time. The most helpful thing he could do, she said, was stay out of it. He had stayed out of it. He told me Gloria had been the one to give Brandon access to the property documents stored in the home office, the insurance papers, the county tax records, the original purchase agreement. She had done it on a Tuesday afternoon while he was in his workshop. He found out 3 weeks later when he noticed the files had been disturbed. When he asked, Gloria told him not to worry about it and to trust her judgment. He had trusted her judgment. Dad, I said. I know, he said quietly. That's why I'm going. The sentencing hearing was on a Thursday morning in early December. I drove to Nashville the night before and did not sleep particularly well, which was not unusual when something the following day mattered to me in ways that went beyond the professional. My father arrived in his good charcoal suit, the one he wore on important church Sundays. He had shined his shoes. I noticed that immediately. He walked into the courtroom with the measured pace of a man who had made a decision he intended to honor completely, and he sat in the witness waiting area with his hands folded and his eyes forward. He did not look at me when he came in. He did not look at Gloria, who was seated in the gallery 3 rows behind me. When his name was called, he rose slowly and walked to the witness stand. Claudette Marsh questioned him for 35 minutes. Robert Reeves answered every question without hesitation and without evasion. He described, in the plain language of a man who had spent his life valuing precision, exactly what he had known and when he had known it. He described Gloria's role in providing Brandon access to the property documents. He described the conversation in which she had told him not to ask questions. He described his own silence, not as something he had been pressured into, but as a choice he had made because it was easier than the alternative, and for which he took complete and unqualified responsibility. His voice did not waver once. When he stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was very quiet. He moved through the gallery with the same deliberate pace he had used walking in. I watched him come toward me and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with legal reasoning that this was the man my father actually was, underneath everything that had gotten in the way of him being it sooner. He stopped beside my seat. He reached out and placed one hand on my shoulder, large, warm, trembling, very slightly. Not from weakness, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who had just spent 35 minutes being completely honest about himself in a room full of strangers. He held it there for just a moment. Then he moved past me toward the back of the courtroom, and I let out a breath I had been holding longer than I could account for. It was the first time my father had chosen me in 37 years. It was enough. The foreclosure proceedings took 11 days. On the 12th day, my father called me from the front porch for the last time. Harold Finch had filed the necessary documents with the Shelby County Court the same week as the sentencing hearing, and the process had moved with the particular efficiency that legal proceedings achieve when the underlying facts are unambiguous and the opposing party has no legitimate standing to contest them. Gloria's attempt to retain a local attorney had stalled within 48 hours when that attorney reviewed the documentation and advised her, I was told, that there was no viable defense to pursue. The quitclaim deed, she had believed, gave her clear title to the property had been executed under circumstances that the court found legally insufficient. Sterling Property, LLC's claim was clean documented and uncontested in any meaningful sense. On the 11th day, the court issued the order. 100% of the ownership rights to 4814 Maple Ridge Drive reverted to the LLC. The following morning, a process server delivered the formal notice to the property, 30 days to vacate, in accordance with Tennessee residential statutes. I was in a client meeting when the confirmation came through on my phone. I read it under the table, returned my phone to my jacket pocket, and continued the meeting without interruption. There was nothing in that notification that required an immediate response. The process was working exactly as it had been designed to work without my presence or my intervention. I did not go to Memphis. I had considered it not to witness anything, not to derive any satisfaction from proximity to what was unfolding, but because there was a part of me that felt some obligation to be present for the ending of something I had built. I ultimately decided against it. The house on Maple Ridge had stopped being mine, in any meaningful emotional sense, long before the court returned it to me legally. Going down to stand in front of it while my mother packed her belongings would have served no purpose that I could honestly defend. My father called on the 22nd day of the 30-day window. It was a Sunday evening, not his usual time, which told me the call was deliberate rather than habitual. He was sitting on the wraparound porch, he said. The weather had been mild for January. He had been out there most of the afternoon. He told me Gloria had been spending her days in the garden. She had not said much since the sentencing, not to him, not to anyone that he knew of. She went out after breakfast each morning, and she worked in the flower beds along the back fence, and she stayed there until the light changed, and then she came inside and made dinner, and they ate together without talking very much. She's going to miss those roses, he said. She planted most of them herself. Did you know that she ordered the bulbs from a catalog the first spring we were here, and she put every one of them in the ground herself? I knew, I said. I had watched her do it on one of my early visits, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee while she knelt in the dirt with the careful attention she gave to things she intended to keep. We stayed on the phone for a while, after that, without saying anything that needed to be said. My father and I had always been better at silence than conversation. It was one of the few things we had genuinely shared across all the years and all the distances between us. Before he hung up, he said, "She's going to take one of the roses when we go. She's already decided which one." I said that seemed right. He said he thought so too. The moving truck came on a Wednesday. I know because Robert texted me a single line that evening. "We're out. Take care of yourself." I read it at my desk in Chicago and held the phone for a moment before setting it down and going back to the brief I had been working on. There was nothing useful to add to those 4 words, and Robert Reeves had never been a man who needed a response to say everything he meant. 6 weeks later, the city of Memphis published the final approved plan for the Maple Ridge Commercial Development Zone, a mixed-use corridor that would bring significant commercial infrastructure to a stretch of residential neighborhoods that had been quietly appreciating for the better part of a decade. The announcement had been anticipated in municipal planning circles for some time. I had known about it for considerably longer than that, because due diligence on a property I was spending $500,000 to build on had included a thorough review of the county's 10-year development projections. The assessed value of 4814 Maple Ridge Drive was recalculated within 2 weeks of the announcement. The new figure was $1.2 million. 7 purchase offers arrived through Harold Finch's office within 48 hours of the property being listed. I reviewed each one. Most came from commercial developers interested in the land value rather than the structure people who would have torn down what I built within 18 months and replaced it with something profitable and entirely without memory. The 7th offer came from a couple named Marcus and Priya Holloway. Marcus was a high school history teacher. Priya was a registered nurse working at a pediatric facility in East Memphis. They had a daughter who was 3 years old and another child expected in the spring. Their offer was not the highest. It was the 4th highest, in fact, but their letter, which their agent had included with the paperwork, described in specific and unembellished terms what the house on Maple Ridge Drive meant to them and what they intended to do with it. They wanted to fill it with the kind of life a house like that was built for. I instructed Harold to accept their offer. The closing took place on a Friday afternoon in February. I signed the documents in Harold's office, which was warm and smelled of old books and the particular institutional coffee that Harold had been brewing in the same machine for as long as I had known him. When the last signature was in place, Harold slid the final page across his desk and told me the wire transfer would clear within 24 hours. $1.175 million. I drove back to my hotel through a city that did not know or care what had just changed hands, and I sat in the quiet of the room for a while and let myself think about my mother, kneeling in the dirt with her catalog roses and the particular care she had given them, and the single stem she had carried out of that garden on a Wednesday in January. $550,000 in, $1.175 million out. My mother had taken a rose. I had taken everything else. I think we both got exactly what we deserved. My grandmother, Ida Mae Reeves, scrubbed other people's floors for 40 years, so her children could have something better. She died 3 months before I passed the bar exam. She never got to know I made it. I had been thinking about her since the closing. There is something that happens after a significant financial transaction, a quietness that descends once the documents are signed and the numbers are settled, and the thing you spent considerable time and energy pursuing has been pursued to its conclusion. It is not dissatisfaction. It is more like the particular stillness of a room after a long conversation has ended, when you are left alone with whatever the conversation was actually about underneath all the words. What the conversation had actually been about. I understood, sitting in Harold's office with the signed documents in front of me, was not the house. It had never really been about the house. It had been about what the house represented, the 40 years of other people's floors, the catalog that arrived every spring with the scholarship deadlines circled in pencil, the particular kind of love that expresses itself not through words or gestures, but through sustained, uncelebrated sacrifice. Ida Mae Reeves had cleaned homes in the Bridgeport neighborhood of Chicago from 1961 until she could no longer climb stairs without assistance. She had raised 4 children in a 2-bedroom apartment on the South Side on the wages of that work, and she had told every one of them, with a consistency that bordered on ritual, that the point of her labor was not her labor, it was theirs. What they built with the ground, she cleared for them. That was the point. She had died on a Tuesday in April, quietly and without drama, in the same apartment where she had lived for 31 years. I had been in my 2nd year of law school. I had taken 3 days off for the funeral and then gone back to class because that was what she would have wanted, and because I did not know another way to honor her than to keep going. She never knew I passed. She never knew about Sterling Wealth Management or the Meridian Tower or any of it. I decided the week after the closing that she was going to know about this. The Ida Mae Reeves Memorial Scholarship would be administered through the University of Memphis School of Law, an institution I had chosen deliberately because Memphis was where the house had been, and because geographic specificity felt important when honoring a woman who had spent her entire life rooted to particular places and particular communities rather than abstract ideals. The scholarship would fund 1 full academic year for a student who demonstrated both financial need and what the application guidelines described as documented resilience in the face of significant personal adversity. I had written that language myself. Not GPA, not test scores, not the polished credentials of students who had never needed anything they could not acquire through effort and access. I wanted the students who had been working the closing shift at the dry cleaner when the application deadlines passed, the ones who had been handling things that scholarship committees did not generally ask about, the ones who reminded me of myself at 18, sitting in a school library after hours because the internet at home was unreliable, filling out forms that represented the only door I could see from where I was standing. The first application cycle closed on a Friday in March. 23 complete applications had been submitted. I had arranged for a review committee of 3, a Memphis-based attorney, a law school faculty member, and a community advocate who ran a legal aid organization on the south side of the city. They had scored each application according to the criteria and provided written assessments. I had asked to read every file myself before the final decision was made. I started on a Saturday morning with a pot of coffee and the kind of focused attention I gave to discovery materials in complex litigation. Each file contained a personal statement, 2 letters of recommendation, academic transcripts, and a financial disclosure. The personal statements were without exception more honest than the ones I typically encountered in professional contexts. There was something about the scholarship criteria that had invited a different kind of candor, a willingness to describe difficulty without softening it for an audience assumed to prefer easier narratives. I read them carefully. All 23. The committee's top-ranked candidate was a 22-year-old from North Memphis who had put himself through a community college degree while working overnight security shifts and caring for a younger sibling. He was exceptional. His statement was clear and specific and entirely free of self-pity, and his letters of recommendation described someone who had already at 22 developed the discipline and judgment that most people spent years in practice acquiring. I noted his file and continued reading. The 23rd application had been submitted on the final day of the cycle, shortly before the midnight deadline. The file was thinner than most, not because it was incomplete, but because the applicant had answered every question with an economy of language that suggested she had learned early that the most important things rarely required elaboration. Jasmine Reeves, 18 years old, Memphis, Tennessee. I read her name twice. The application listed her high school GPA 3.8, maintained while working 2 part-time positions, and her intended area of legal focus, public interest law, specifically housing rights and tenant advocacy. Her personal statement described growing up in a household managed entirely by her mother, navigating a school system that had not always made it easy to be the student she was determined to be, and arriving at the decision to pursue law through a specific and unromantic process of elimination. She had identified the problems in her community that most needed solving and worked backward to the profession most equipped to solve them. She had not mentioned her father anywhere in the main application. The family information section, which applicants were required to complete for financial verification purposes, listed her mother's name and employment, her own part-time income, and a single line under the paternal information field. Father Brandon Reeves, currently incarcerated Shelby County Correctional. I set the folder down. I picked it back up. I read it again from the beginning. Jasmine Reeves had never mentioned her father's name in her application. Not once. Not in the essay. Not in the family section. Just a single line, father absent. I understood, reading that line a second time, that it was not an omission born of oversight. Jasmine Reeves had made a deliberate choice about what to include and what to leave out of the story she presented to the world, and she had decided at 18 years old that her father's absence was a fact of her life rather than the defining narrative of it. That was not a small distinction. Most people twice her age had not learned to make it. I read her personal statement 3 times. She had written it in the direct, unadorned voice of someone who had not been taught to dress up difficult things in prettier language and had not acquired that habit on her own. She described growing up in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Memphis with her mother, who worked double shifts as a home health aide to keep them housed and fed, and who had, by Jasmine's account, never once in her life complained about the weight of what she was carrying. She described taking her first part-time position at 14 cashier at a neighborhood grocery, not because her mother asked her to, but because she had done the arithmetic on the household budget one evening while her mother slept and understood, without being told, that the numbers needed help. She described the moment she decided on law with the same practical clarity. She had been 16, sitting in on a housing court, proceeding with a community organization that her school partnered with for a civic education program. A family was being removed from their home on the basis of a lease violation. That Jasmine, reading the document over the shoulder of the person in front of her, did not believe the family had actually committed. The attorney representing the landlord knew the procedure. The family had no one who knew the procedure. The outcome was decided before anyone spoke. She had gone home that afternoon and looked up what it took to become a lawyer. She wrote, "I am not interested in the kind of law that serves people who already have everything they need to protect themselves. I want to stand in the rooms where the procedure is the only thing that matters and make sure the people who don't know the procedure have someone who does." I set the essay down and looked out the window of my home office for a long moment. Jasmine Reeves did not know that the scholarship she had applied for had been established by her father's older sister. She did not know that the woman who would be reading her application had spent the better part of the past year dismantling the scheme that had put her father in Shelby County Correctional. She did not know any of the history that connected her to this particular fund, administered by this particular institution, carrying the name of a woman who was her great-grandmother and whom she had almost certainly never met. She had applied because she needed the money and met the criteria and believed correctly that her story was worth telling. The review committee met on a Tuesday afternoon, a video call, the 3 members joining from their respective offices across Memphis. I had shared Jasmine's file, along with the others the previous week, and asked for their assessments without indicating any personal interest in any particular application. The committee chair, the attorney, a measured and experienced woman named Dr. Lorraine Webb, who had practiced housing law in Memphis for 22 years, opened by saying that the review had been straightforward. In one respect, one application had distinguished itself from the others in a way that made the final decision relatively uncomplicated. She was referring to Jasmine. The faculty member agreed. The community advocate agreed. They discussed 2 other applications, briefly, including the 22-year-old from North Memphis, whom they agreed would benefit significantly from a referral to a separate fellowship program, better suited to his particular circumstances, and then returned to Jasmine's file with the kind of attention that the best candidates always generate in rooms full of people who recognize something real when they encounter it. I listened. I did not redirect the conversation or advocate for any outcome. I had structured the process specifically so that the decision would stand on its own merits, regardless of my personal connection to the applicant. And the decision the committee reached did exactly that. At the end of the call, Dr. Webb asked if I was prepared to authorize the award. I said yes, without hesitation. After the call ended, I sat at my desk for a while without doing anything in particular. Then I pulled up the award notification template, filled in Jasmine's name and contact information, and the disbursement details, and added a personal note at the bottom of the letter, a single line separate from the formal text, in the smaller font I used for handwritten editions when I signed physical correspondence. Your grandmother, Ida May, would have been proud of you. I read it once. Then I authorized the letter for distribution. The signature field at the bottom of the note gave me a brief pause. My full name felt like too much a door, opened too wide into rooms Jasmine had not been invited into and might not be ready for. A title felt impersonal in a way that the rest of the note was not. I typed a single letter, D. I never signed my full name on that note. Just D. Maybe one day Jasmine will understand. Maybe she won't need to. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, 6 months after sentencing. Plain white envelope, no return address. Just my name written in handwriting I recognized from birthday cards I stopped receiving years ago. I almost set it aside. I had developed over the preceding months a fairly efficient system for managing correspondence that required emotional labor. A separate tray on my desk reviewed on Friday afternoons when I had sufficient distance from the week to engage with difficult things without letting them bleed into the work. But something about the handwriting stopped me. Not nostalgia exactly. Something more like recognition, the particular sensation of encountering something familiar in a context where you had stopped expecting it. I opened it at my desk on a Wednesday afternoon, with the city going about its ordinary business 34 floors below. 3 pages, yellow legal pad paper, the kind sold at every drugstore and corner market in the country. The line slightly uneven, as though the pad had been resting on something that was not quite flat. The handwriting was careful, in the way handwriting becomes when someone has decided that what they are writing matters, and they want the physical act of putting it down to reflect that. He did not begin with an apology. I noted that immediately, and I noted it as a point in his favor. A man who begins a letter like this with an apology is usually writing for himself, building toward absolution, managing his own discomfort. Brandon had begun instead with a statement of fact. He wrote, "I know you don't owe me anything. I'm not writing because I think you do." He wrote that he had spent the first several months after his arrest telling himself a version of events in which Kyle Patterson was entirely responsible for what had happened, and Brandon was simply a man who had been deceived. He said he had believed that version because it was more comfortable than the alternative, and because Gerald Park had gently indicated that a certain degree of that framing was legally useful during the cooperation process. But somewhere around the third month alone, with the particular kind of time that institutional life provides in quantities most people never encounter, he had run out of ways to make that version hold together. He had known, he wrote, that something was not right about Kyle from approximately the fourth week of their acquaintance. There had been a conversation, casual, over dinner, at a restaurant in Midtown Memphis, in which Kyle had said something about a previous business arrangement that had not worked out the way he had planned, and the way he had described the other parties involved had been cold, in a way that did not match the warmth he performed the rest of the time. Brandon had noticed. He had filed it away in the back of his mind, in the same way he wrote that he had filed away a lot of things he did not want to examine too closely, because examining them would have required him to ask questions whose answers might have closed a door he very much wanted to stay open. He wrote, "I wanted out. Not out of anything specific, just out of being the person I had been for 32 years. Kyle felt like the door. I knew the door might not be what it looked like, and I walked through it anyway because I was tired of standing in the hallway." I read that paragraph twice. He wrote about Jasmine in the second half of the third page in handwriting that had lost some of its careful evenness, as though the subject matter had made it harder to maintain the same level of control over the pen. He said she was the reason he had finally decided to write, not because he wanted her to know where he was, or to have any contact with him before she was ready, but because he had been thinking about what it meant to have her carry the name Reeves in a city where that name was now attached to things he was not proud of. He wrote that she was smarter than he had ever been, and more disciplined, and that she deserved every good thing that was ahead of her, without the weight of what he had done dragging behind it. He said he did not know how to make that possible from where he was sitting, but he wanted Diana to know that he thought about it, that Jasmine was the thing he thought about most. He closed with 4 sentences. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I just need you to know that I know what I did, and I know what it cost." I read the letter twice, slowly. The second time, without annotation, just reading the way you read things that are not evidence and not documents, and not anything that requires a professional response. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases, slid it back into the plain, white envelope, and crossed the room to my filing cabinet. The second drawer from the bottom contained a single manila folder. Inside that folder was a copy of Jasmine Reeves's scholarship application, the version with Dr. Lorraine Webb's review notes in the margin, and the award authorization stamp in the lower right corner. I placed Brandon's letter behind it. 2 pieces of paper, 1 family. I closed the drawer. I didn't know yet what to do with either of them. My father moved into a small apartment on the east side of Memphis. He called every Sunday. I answered every third call. My mother did not call at all. The apartment was on the second floor of a building near Audubon Park. I knew this because Robert had described it to me in some detail during one of the early Sunday calls, with the particular attention to spatial arrangement that a man who had spent 30 years working with his hands brings to the evaluation of any new physical space. 2 bedrooms, though he only needed 1. A kitchen with adequate counter space. A parking spot that was covered, which mattered, because he had spent enough winters in Chicago to have strong opinions about covered parking. He had set up his woodworking tools in the second bedroom, which was smaller than the workshop at Maple Ridge, but sufficient, he said, for the scale of projects he was taking on these days. He said things like that, these days, as though the life currently in progress was a distinct chapter from the one before it clearly delineated, requiring its own vocabulary. I appreciated the effort that took, even if I did not say so. The Sunday calls were brief, by unspoken mutual agreement, 15 minutes, sometimes 20, almost never longer. We talked about his projects. He had taken on a commission from a church in Midtown that needed new pew end panels, a job that would keep him occupied for the better part of 3 months, and that he described with the focused satisfaction of a man who had found in the act of making things the most reliable form of equilibrium available to him. I told him about cases I was working on in the general terms I used with anyone who was not professionally involved. He asked whether I was eating properly, which was the question he had been asking me since law school, and which I had long since stopped being irritated by. We did not discuss Gloria. We did not discuss Brandon. We did not discuss the house on Maple Ridge, or the foreclosure, or the sentencing, or any of the events of the preceding year that had brought us to this particular arrangement of Sunday phone calls, and answered every third one. Those things existed between us, the way certain geological features exist in landscapes, present shaping everything around them, not requiring discussion to be real. I answered every third call, because I was not ready to answer every call. I did not decline every call, because I was not ready to stop answering entirely. That was the most honest accounting I could give of where I was, and I had learned over the course of a year that had required considerable precision in the management of difficult things, that honesty about where you actually were was more useful than performing a position you had not yet reached. My mother, as far as I knew, had moved in with her younger sister Patricia, not the banker Patricia, but a woman named Patricia Simmons, who lived in a modest house in Whitehaven, and who had been, by all family accounts, the sibling Gloria had always been closest to. I had no direct information about her circumstances, beyond what Robert mentioned occasionally, and what reached me through the peripheral channels of extended family, a cousin's text message, here, a brief mention in a holiday card there. She was well, by all reports. She had found a church she liked. She was keeping herself occupied. She did not call. I had thought, in the early weeks after the eviction, that she might. Not to apologize. I did not expect that, and I had made my peace with not expecting it. But because Gloria Reeves had spent 64 years defining herself in relation to her children and her household, and I had imagined that the removal of both might create a silence she would eventually feel compelled to fill, I had been wrong about that. Gloria was apparently more capable of sustained silence than I had given her credit for, which was information about her character that I filed away with the complicated mixture of surprise and recognition that characterized most of what I had learned about my mother over the preceding year. The message from the neighbor arrived on a Tuesday evening in April. Not a call, just a text from a woman named Dolores, who had lived 2 doors down from Maple Ridge, and who had always been friendly in the uncomplicated way of people who are simply good neighbors without requiring anything from the relationship beyond basic human warmth. Dolores had apparently run into Gloria at a garden center on the south side of Memphis. She said Gloria had looked well. She said she had seemed purposeful the way people seem when they have somewhere specific they need to be. And she mentioned in the casual way that people mention things they assume will be received as pleasant news, that Gloria had bought a collection of climbing rose starts that were apparently intended for the balcony railing of wherever she was currently living. I read the message standing in my kitchen with a glass of water I had poured and then forgotten about. I thought about my mother kneeling in the dirt at Maple Ridge with her catalog roses and her canvas gloves and her total unapologetic commitment to the idea that where you put your attention was where beauty would eventually follow. I thought about the single stem she had carried out of that garden on a Wednesday morning in January, when everything else she thought she had secured had been taken back. And now apparently she was starting again, on a balcony railing with climbing starts that would need something to hold on to. I set my phone down on the counter without responding to Dolores's message. I made dinner. I ate at my kitchen table and read through a brief I needed to finish by morning. Before I went to bed, I picked up my phone and looked at the message again. I did not reply, but I did not delete it either. I placed the phone on my nightstand screen down and turned off the lamp. In the dark, I thought briefly about balcony railings and climbing roses and the particular stubbornness of things that insist on growing, regardless of the conditions available to them. I don't know what my mother and I will be to each other in 10 years. I don't know if we will be anything at all, but I know this: I hope her roses grow. I am standing at my office window on the 34th floor. Chicago stretches out below me, gray and glittering and indifferent. I built my place in this city the same way I built everything else in my life, alone, carefully, and without asking permission. It is a Tuesday morning. 14 years ago, on a Tuesday morning, I sat in a room with 47 other people and raised my right hand and was admitted to the bar. I was wearing a suit I had bought on sale at a department store on Michigan Avenue the previous Saturday, and I had eaten a granola bar for breakfast because I had been too nervous to sit down to a real meal, and there was no one in the gallery there for me. I had not told anyone it was happening. I had not known then how to let people be present for the things that mattered most to me. I am still learning that. I think about the people who built me, not the ones who were supposed to, necessarily, but the ones who actually did. There was a woman who cleaned other people's homes for 40 years and told every person she loved that the point of her labor was not her labor. She never saw the thing I built with the ground she cleared for me. But I have come to believe in the way that I believe things I cannot prove, but feel with a certainty that goes beyond argument, that she knows. That somewhere in the mercy of God she knows. That is the first thing I have learned to trust, that I cannot put in a legal brief. There was a man who shined his shoes before he walked into the hardest room of his life, and who said nothing when he put his hand on my shoulder, because nothing needed to be said. I did not know for a long time how to receive that kind of love, the kind that arrives late and imperfectly, and does not ask to be pardoned for its lateness. I am learning, slowly, the way I learn everything that matters, by doing it badly first, and then doing it less badly, and eventually arriving at something that resembles competence. And there is a young woman I have never met somewhere in Memphis who decided at 16 years old, in a housing courtroom, that the world needed people who knew the procedure, and who has been building herself into one of those people ever since. I do not know if she will ever understand the full geography of how she came to receive what she received. I have put that in God's hands, which is where I put the things I cannot control, and have decided to stop trying to. That is the second thing. I look out at the city below me, and I try, as I sometimes do in the quiet of early morning, before the work begins to locate the feeling I expected to have at the end of all of this. The satisfaction I anticipated. The clean, completed sense of a ledger balanced and a wrong made right. It is there if I look for it. The outcome was what it was, and the outcome was just, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is not the largest thing I feel. It is not even close to the largest thing. The largest thing is something I do not have a legal term for. It is the feeling of standing in your own life without apology, of understanding in a way that goes past the intellectual and into the cellular, that your worth was never located in someone else's willingness to see it, that you were not waiting for their recognition, that you never were. I spent 37 years believing in some part of myself. I did not examine often enough that the love withheld was a verdict on the person it was withheld from. That if the people who were supposed to see you most clearly could not see you, perhaps you were not as visible as you believed. That belief lived very quietly in me for a very long time, underneath the degrees and the billable hours, in the corner office and the client list. It shaped more than I knew. I do not believe it anymore. I am not certain when it changed. Not a single morning, not a single decision. More like the way light changes in a room over the course of a day. gradually, and then all at once, and then so completely that you cannot remember what the room looked like before. I think God works something like that too. Not in the dramatic moments, though those happen. In the accumulation of ordinary ones. In the Tuesday mornings and the Sunday phone calls, and the scholarship applications submitted just before the deadline by 18-year-olds who have already survived more than most people ever will. That is the third thing, and it is the most important one. The revenge was never the money or the house. It was not the 8 counts read into the record of a federal court on a Tuesday afternoon in Nashville. It was not the $1.175 million that cleared into my account on a Friday morning in February. It was not the eviction notice or the foreclosure or any of the legal mechanisms that moved with such clean and final precision once I set them in motion. The revenge, if that is even the right word for it, and I am less sure that it is than I once was the morning I finally stopped needing them to see my worth. Was the moment I understood that I had been measuring myself against a standard that was never going to be applied fairly, and that the liberation available to me was not in changing the standard, but in walking away from the measurement entirely. I built this life. I built it the same way my grandmother built hers, and the same way that young woman in Memphis is building hers, and the same way that every person who has ever had to become their own foundation has built theirs, with whatever was available in whatever time existed, without waiting for permission or validation or the particular grace of being chosen first. I was enough. I always was. I turn from the window. My desk is waiting. The morning is waiting. There is work to be done, and I have always known how to do the work. If this story found you today, I do not think it was an accident. If you have ever built something real, out of difficult materials, out of loss, out of disappointment, out of the particular loneliness of being underestimated by the people who should have known better, then you already understand everything I have been trying to say. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. I read every one. And if this reached someone you love, someone who needs to be reminded that their worth was never up for a vote, share it with them. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And until then, take care of yourself the way you deserve to be taken care of. That is all. That is everything.